Now, I want to just talk about Peter for 1 second and do a real introduction here. Okay, so I'm not going to read his resume. I think you guys all know who he is. Peter is one of the intellectual leaders of the BARC program. If you have not had him yet, it's because he just started 10 days ago. But that is my guess, that will be his role here in 4A. So I'm really proud to have him here with us. Peter is invested in architecture as a body of knowledge, and he always will bring that subject up in any discussion of architecture, that it is not about buildings, but that architecture is about a body of knowledge. And I really appreciate that about him. He also supports this idea of the Amiga or any number of other lists of things which contain elements of architecture or parts, where we can begin to see which things in architecture endure over time, how architects deal with ground, how they deal with stairs, floors, roofs, ground, all of those things, and how they get tweaked and transformed and mutated over time by different paradigms, by different architects, and by different discourses over time. So, one thing we were just discussing also is he's also very interested in part-to-whole relations, which currently the discussion is that part-to-whole probably runs through all of the Amiga, but not sure yet. I'm really interested to hear what he's going to say. And you know, his work is based on how parts are brought together, not into wholes necessarily, but I would call it into non-whole sets or agglomerations, which in his own words end up as weirdo things, which I like very much. So Peter is, he's a hybrid X-factor in my mind also, because he has roots in the Dutch and the Austrian traditions. It might be said that those traditions, when spliced together, explode. Peter is that explosion. In his own words, he's moving from beast to brain these days. His way of saying that he's moving from the individual expression model to the project model. I think that maybe there are still particles of beast in that brain, which is why I'm such a huge fan of Peter. Please welcome our werewolf vampire hybrid, Peter Trummer.
Well, I know why I'm out here. These are the nicest people I've ever met in my whole life, you know. So you see, I mean, you might be an Austrian, turn into Dutch, but as I said recently, I could only survive it because there was still the utopia, the US, you know, especially Los Angeles. Now, I know first I thought, God, this is going to be a scary lecture because, you know, how pretentious it is that I come up here and tell you what architecture is. Yeah? But what I want to show you today is that it's actually it's something which became a default to me, you know. Since I have moved around in different places and since I became, like you, a student of architecture, each time when something got confronted to me, I thought, is that really true what he or she is saying to me? I mean, that cannot be true, you know? And so each time that I have raised this question, someone else came up and told me, yeah, it might be like this or it might be like this. So what happened over the years, as a default, that I sort of collected just by pure coincidence or kind of curiosity, what did people think what actually architecture is? So what I show you today is a kind of, you could say, a catalog, a collection, totally rudimentary. A lot of things are missing. People who are really scholar are going to hit me because basically it's a lie what I'm saying. Yeah? So and since I'm a dyslexic, I just half the things I read differently. You know. So, but I think what I want to offer you is a kind of insight to my curriculum and to this collection of ideas. So, in a certain way, what I'm showing to you today is not that I state to you what I think architecture is, but I want to show you through individual characters their idea. And I do it very simple. I call it like what is architecture? A kind of a speculative history of this idea. Now, what I mean by that history, because still that I'm trained as a European, and I cannot deny that, everything started with Egypt, yeah? So I'm going to start with Egypt, and I'm end today in LA, yeah? I don't know why we always started in Egypt in Europe, yeah, but probably Egypt is the absolutely utopia, yeah, for the Europeans. Yeah? Politically speaking, they still have difficulties, but after a while, historically, they will realize, you know, it was Africa who defined the roots of European culture. So, so I'm going to start with that, and I start with that list that I still like it without the A. I think this MIGA, somehow it looks like more like a space shuttle or something. But what you could say is, in principle, it's absolutely right what Tom said and what he has set up, and I think it's a really interesting idea of building up a curriculum. It basically defines a mass, an interiority, a ground, an aperture, an articulation, which I, in a certain way, relate a little bit to, which I think goes in the area of tectonic. Now, of course, as you would say, yeah, but listen, this counts to everything. This counts to every building. This counts to every architecture. So what is then architecture? And so, since this is true that every building could have all these 5 points, is it really that we can still talk about architecture? So the moment that I thought what architecture actually is, I came to one quote that I think is the base for that lecture, and that is a quote by Ungers in his inaugural speech in 1964, where he says, buildings are just damned to the arbitrariness to build, and architecture is damned to the tyranny of the idea. So instead, so what it means is principle, and this is I think what Tom always likes to me, I just hate buildings, but I love architecture, yeah? So, and that became the conclusion to look at what are these ideas. So how do I start? Now, as you can see, I will go and start with just interpretation of people. And the first guy I want to introduce you is basically a guy called Aldo Riegl. And he said in his little architecture, he asked, what is architecture? Now, he started like this. Well, the Egyptian, is that architecture? Well, what you can see is they had made a gigantic mess, but if we think about what they really have done, they had just have little carved out little spaces out of that mass, you know. And so what he would say in his definition, you know, when he then goes to images like that, he would say the Egyptians haven't yet done architecture. What they have done is something what he called a tactical space, something where the figure is molded into the mass, and actually I can only have an appreciation for that by being tactile to that. So the Egyptian for him, for Riegl, was not yet architecture, it was just actually building mass. And there is a really interesting story to one of the temples that are full of columns. The column actually in that time is still conceived as a mass. Yeah? You couldn't move in there, it was actually just mass with an engravement into the space. But then Riegl says, oh, well, probably the Greeks are the ones who started architecture, you know? And so he looked at this temple, this the Parthenon temple, and then he says, I'm not so sure about the Greeks, because what they actually did is they just made columns. Yeah? I mean, it looks like as if they would make spaces, but actually, no. They just made woods of columns. Yeah? And so what you can see, and I think the ruins express it much nicer, because if you once are, for some of you who still don't know what to do, so go to Italy, there is this nice Greek temple in Paestum, you know, and what you can see is just columns. Huh? And so, and I think Le Corbusier was absolutely right when he made this little sketch, because what Riegl just said is the Greek didn't make space, but they also didn't make tactile space. What they made is an optical space, yeah? So it was not still architecture for them, it was just an idea of optic. Huh? And then he comes, and of course here we are, with the Romans. He says the Romans are doing architecture. And the reason what Riegl meant by architecture is suddenly that he says, what clarifies the Romans is that the first time someone made a mass and carved out a space. And so by that definition that Riegl gave in the idea of the Pantheon, is basically the articulation that the core to architecture, the unique thing to architecture that no other discipline has, is in principle its relationship that it, on the one hand side it produces a mass, but at the same time it actually creates a space, or it forms an inner space out of a particular mass. And so he comes to the definition, and I think here it says it very nicely. It says, what distinguishes Roman architecture from Egyptian and Greek architecture lies on the one hand, on the creation of spaces, on the other hand, of the composition of masses. Just to know, please forgive me, these are all my translations, so they're all, it's just, okay. wait, when it comes to French, that sucks completely, yeah? But I think that sarcophage is a really interesting answer to the first time what Roman architecture is about. In order to make suddenly that sarcophage, you had to carve out void spaces from a mass to actually articulate a figurative mass onto the facade. And so that dualism, and I think he calls this colorism, yeah? That kind of idea of colorism, basically where you have two kind of volumetric entities, the mass and the void, and how they join together start to become architecture. And I think a more nicer definition of that is probably Henri Foucault's, Faucillion's idea, where he says, and I think this is another of these French historians, is the only one who can read. It is perhaps the inner mass in which the origin of architecture lies. By giving the void space a particular form, and I think this is where it counts very interesting what he says in the last sentence to the idea of Graham Harman recently, where he says architecture then creates an autonomous world, yeah, inside of that. And so I think, and I think and when you continue him, he says, now what is then the architect? So he says the architect is then on the one hand side, he's a sculptor when it comes to massing, he's a geometer when it comes to plan, he's a mechanic when it turns to structure, and he's a painter when it distributes effects. Yeah? And so if you look at the Amiga project, you basically can see why there is this unique thing that you are not an architect by building masses, you're an architect produce effects, you're a geometer by making the geometry, and of course you're a mechanic, well, not anymore these days, but let's say. And so that's why I always thought the person that really expressed that the most nicely was an interview of Louis Kahn, who says, I am not a designer, I'm a composer. Yeah? I am basically composing spaces. So in that sense, this was always for me a very interesting introduction to kind of the history of where we started. And as you can see, it was the idea of how architecture is articulated by the idea of an interiority, yeah, by a mass. But then, around the 15th century, 1450, Alberti comes with two statements. I think that most of the scholars of you might laugh about them, but I think they're very interesting because they articulate, I would say, the beginning of a whole set of questioning what are these masses and void spaces we have done so far. Yeah? Are they just a bunch of stones, or how do we actually sample them together? And so Alberti comes with this nice thing. Well, just to know, this is my interpretation. You know, I made a circle so that you can visualize it better. Yeah. So if a circle house, yeah, is like a bunch of circles, small city, and a large bunch of circles, a city, is like a large house, then the house can be seen as a small, you know, aggregated city, or the city can be seen as a large house. And so that idea that a building, or that we have to understand it, there is something that we have to work towards a whole. So what we conceive as a mass or void is actually towards a whole. For Alberti, it was totally clear, you have to sacrifice, every individual has to sacrifice its individuality towards that whole. Yeah? And so then he says, if we make then a building, the art of building, we have 6 things that define them. We make a region, then we make a platform, then we subdivide the platform, then we extrude walls, then we cover it, and then we make holes in it. Yeah? And so these elements, and I think you can really read them as the 5 elements that in principle Tom has pointed out. The idea to Alberti was that all these parts have to sacrifice to come to a whole. Now, and of course, the difficulty is now, how can I bridge from here, basically, to the 18th century, yeah? But I thought I'd do it with one little detail to show you that idea. So, for example, in Alberti Rucellai Palazzo, yeah, you would say that what Alberti thought a column is, yeah, or a wall is, he would say it's just the ensemble of columns next to each other. So a wall is not a wall. What a wall is basically the assembly of columns. And if you have an opening, it's just the space in between columns. So for Alberti, the idea was that the wall is in principle an array of columns. And if you have an opening, it's just the opening in between. But then And I think I relate, just to know, the historians I'm now working on is Wölfflin, yeah, another one of these freaky, you know, Middle Europeans, yeah. Because what Wölfflin then shows, what really shifted from the Renaissance to the Baroque is basically that suddenly the column suddenly slightly moved out of the wall. So the part moved out of the wall, and of course we all know it got this idea of the painterly effect, yeah, versus the linear effect, because suddenly the column produced a shadow, yeah, on the surface that through its curvature suddenly had this gradient shadow. So what Wölfflin said, basically what you can see is the part is moving out from the whole. And I would even go, and this is now my idiot speculation, I would say, and here comes Ledoux, he says, and here the part became its own individuality. It moved out of the wall and it stands there as itself. Yeah? And so to me, that kind of history from Alberti until the 18th century was a history that I have sketched like this. Yeah? So for Alberti, the column is in the wall, Bramante, he pushes it slightly out, you know, and then, you know, Borromini makes the curve, and then Ledoux jumps the column out of the wall. Yeah? Now, it might be laughing, but I think there's a really interesting argument to that, because in the 18th century, what we see is when Alberti was saying that there was every individual part need to sacrifice towards the whole, I think with the industrialization, a reorganization of the ideas come, and that is a very interesting thought. And there must be something really happening, because Ledoux's column was not just a column. Ledoux's column was a strange idea of circular, squarish. Just to know, this is all my images come from the internet, so this is one from Liebes Woods, yeah? Yeah, yeah, I like Liebes Woods. This is Liebes Woods, yeah? So some ideas are in the images, yeah? So Liebes Woods is in the image. So the interesting thing is there must have been something else going on, because not only the column becomes an individual entity, every part of the column itself became a part separate from the other. And so what can be said that within Ledoux's work, or especially in the work around the 18th century, there seems to be a reorganization of how we thought about architecture and how we thought about the architectural object itself. Now, in order to understand that, I give you a little idea. Now, in the 18th century, with the upcoming of the French national state and the upcoming of the French Revolution, of course, you still see in the work of Boulez something that I would say is still back Roman, yeah? Where it tries to build a similar mass void agglomeration of spaces for a new collective. You see it in the Syntograph for Newton, or then also for my French, I'm not even going to say it, and for the library. Yeah? In principle, what it was spaces for a new collective, but that spaces had a Platonic volume carved out. But in Ledoux's work, there was something different, because if you look at the Salt work, you can, even when Anthony Fiedler always compares that to the kind of panopticon of Bentham, I completely disagree. Yeah? I think there's something else going on, and the person that sort of gave me an insight of that is probably a book that, I don't know if it consists in English, but it's called From Ledoux to Le Corbusier, and it's called The Origin of the Autonomous Architecture. Now, in order to understand that, what Kaufmann does to describe Ledoux's work is the following. Within the Baroque, he said, we still had an idea of the ensemble, yeah? Which means there was a central space, there was a symmetry, and then the parts, you know, more or less orchestrate their centrality towards that hierarchy. Yeah? And he gave a diagram for that, and he said, architecture is basically heteronomous, which means that every individual part sacrifices its individuality to fall into the representation of that ensemble. But what you see in Ledoux's work, he suddenly starts to separate these elements. He suddenly, this is the first attempt, it's a kind of factory where you can see that he, even when they look like as if they would assemble a whole, they basically get spread. And thanks to Andrew Zago, who made the most beautiful drawing of this. This is from Andrew Zago's course here. This is the project of Ledoux, where you can see that suddenly architecture came its own individual building. So architecture was not anymore resembled into being connected by each other. It became suddenly an autonomous building by itself. Yeah? And here you can see that this was one of the projects where suddenly the middle part and the separate from each other. And so Kaufmann calls it autonomous architecture, the pavilion system of Ledoux, and he would argue this is the beginning of modernism, where suddenly this is the beginning of the modern diagram, where the individual building disconnects itself from the neighboring building and it becomes an autonomous entity. Yeah? And then Kaufmann writes is that individuation, so that making individual architectural part is the most important result of the architectural regeneration process in the end of the 18th century. The new autonomous principle doesn't accept that architecture is determined by external laws, forces of representation. So that idea of autonomy in that sense was not only an autonomy related that we understand today as a kind of disciplinary autonomy. It was really it was an idea that happened within the society of the 18th century, yeah? That there is no such thing as a power of which we represent something. There is a vibe in which, and I think what Kaufmann once says, the 18th century saw the stone again as a stone and not as a representation of something else. And I think two people made a very contribution that we all know that gave them basically, you could say, a pedagogical model for that. The first one, of course, was a student from Turin, yeah, which was the first one who suddenly redrew any kind of building based on the idea of the grid and the ensemble of parts. Yeah? So these are not anymore forms of figurative spaces in terms of hierarchy. No, what you can see is you see the grid, the standardized element, yeah, and the repetition of the standardized element. It's really sorry, I couldn't find it, but he has done it also for Palladio Villa. Yeah, he sort of, put Palladio into standardized mass production model. Huh? So that means that reorganization of industrialization turned now each building to the ensemble of its parts, but of course it still had one thing in common, and that was the idea of the grid. The grid, basically the grid was the ground which orchestrated the parts. And here you can see from Theron another example where nearly every architectural element, the entrance, the porch, became systematized as a standardized object. And this is where I'm sorry that I couldn't find the Alberti stuff. But here you can see the redrawing of some of the villas, the 9-square villas, or any other villas that are based in principle of that time to become a mode of a totally different industrial organization. The person that I like most of that period was the student of Ledoux. I'm not going to say it because, as you know, my French. Anyhow, he's the guy over there with a D. Yeah? Because what is interesting here, these are the first plans of houses that the student of Ledoux did. But instead of sort of reducing it, the plan to a standardized object of individual architectural parts, he was the first one who turned it into the individualization of spaces of parts. As you can see here on the left side, if you imagine that we had Palladio with his 9-square grids, it's not so that he doesn't make this grid, but shifting basically the external square, that became an individualization of each of the spaces, even when they were joined together. Yeah? And I think this diagram we will see later on with Duisburg, and I think it goes to John Hejduk and so on. But I think this is the interesting thing. All these houses were not anymore part of a larger composition of which the parts are composed, but every part of the square of the buildings turned into its own individual entity. And you can see you had smaller spaces, larger spaces, and they already had a figurative element to be visualized. So then Kaufmann writes, and I think to today's discourse, and I think hopefully with Graham Harman we can talk about that one, because I think preparing that lecture I found this a very interesting statement. He said, the new assembly of parts means the free accumulation of individuals, so here he refers to the French society, which do not sacrifice their autonomy. Their forms only relate to their inner necessity, and the inner law determines their gestalt. In that case, we have to understand the anti-Baroque plan, which is the plan which has a center and then a periphery, in which new relationship of parts to each other and parts in relationship to other wholes are formed until, and I think here it becomes, until in the end, no parts exist anymore, but only new architectural wholes or objects. So in that sense, I think probably my whole lecture could have also said a speculative history to make just wholes, meaning to form things together to make one. Now, just to be clear, that conflict goes through also in urbanism. You know, here with Nolly plan, Nolly, you would say, has still a Baroque idea because architecture is not visualized. And then with Piranesi, you see the new diagram emerging, every individual object, every building become itself. And that idea turns into the 19th century grid, where every block becomes an individual entity assembled on the grid, and it of course turns to the modernist diagram of Le Corbusier Plan Beaux-Arts. I just realized the images are all interesting. Yeah. No, because they are blurry, you know. Yeah? My new computer has shifted apart the whole relationship of the pixels. Yeah? So what I'm saying that with that, I wanted to introduce that suddenly within modernism, that idea that a part has its own individuality, I think is now the core essence to me on understanding what happened around the beginning of the 20th century, when then within modernism, the idea became elaborated. Now, I know it might be for many of you common knowledge to all of these, but still, hopefully that some of you might want still understand the slightly difference of that. So, for example, if we see a Mies van der Rohe pavilion, you still see that Mies articulates suddenly every individual part by a different material element. So for Mies, the floor is based on the grid, the column is based on the metal, the wall is based on the thing, and by distinguishing each of them into a different material, they articulate their autonomy as a form rather than as an architectural element. Because suddenly the column is not seen as a column, the column is seen as a line, the surface, the wall is not seen as a wall, but the wall is seen as a surface. And I think, and I know that one of the students even made a very interesting, thesis with Marcelin or so, where you could even see that he would never place the column into the grid. He would always place it into the field so that the column has an autonomy and doesn't relate to the grid as large. So there is a work in, I think in Mies van der Rohe, where every individual parts more or less turns into the most abstract geometrical element. Yeah? Now that is slightly different, I think, with Le Corbusier. We all know his 5 parts, but the 5 parts in his case have nothing to do with geometry only. They have to do with architectural parts. The pelote is a column that carries something. The floor is how it organized plans. The garden is basically a reproduction of the ground. The window is in principle the relationship, how to look to the in and the outside. And the facade element is a production of prefabricated elements. Now, why I think Le Corbusier is a weird figure, because he also did not only draw these diagrams where you can see what is the column different to the 19th century brick housing, what is the free plan different to the space and space plan, what is the ground different, what is the window different, how do you look outside, but of course he also gave us an idea of massing and voids, and that's what I think I've not seen with Mies. I have never seen it with Mies. I think in that sense, I've never seen in Mies an idea of massing and void. I've only seen in Mies the singular individual entity. But here, I think this is where Eisenman then always argues, I guess, that Le Corbusier is Roman. because what you can see is that he has a mass, that's the middle part, number 2, as a solid. Then he has the mass in void. I think that's very interesting. So he has the reversed model of the Pantheon. Yeah? Then this, you could say, is in slightly the Pantheon. You have a mass of which you carved out. And this is probably the only one for me as a hybrid of the Baroque to the Ring, is the assembly of parts generating a larger mass. Yeah? Because you have one part, another part, another part, another part, assembling together a larger mass. But to me, the work that I think, I don't know if you know it, but the work that inspired me in modernist era is actually the work of Paul Klee. Klee in the Bauhaus area probably went to the most radical understanding what is actually the abstraction of form as such of individual parts. And so he would come up with diagrams where he would say, what is the square, what is the triangle, and what is the circle? What are they as pure geometry, pure autonomous forms? Yeah? What causes their actuality, and how could you describe it? I know there's one diagram I don't have, but I couldn't find it, but it's really beautiful. It's the point to line to surface thing, so yeah, where basically you have to gradually, I couldn't find it. But that idea that to describe form, not anymore representing something, but pure by abstraction of point lines and walls, leaves him to these kind of diagrams where he would say, what is the basic content of these? Now, this content is not, of course, the content that relates to anything what they means. The content is, what is it made of? Is the circle a central space? How would you make a circle? You basically, or not a circle, but how would you make a flat thing? It would be the rotation of lines. Yeah? So he described, in principle, the forces and the fields of an autonomous architectural language basically based on geometry. Now, that led in the Bauhaus to very interesting articulation of what then architecture massing means, because then there were exercises of the line. So how can make a line make space? Yeah? Or how can make a surface make space by folding? Yeah? Or how can make color make articulation? And of course, how do individual volumes assemble together to come a whole, yeah? But every individual element still being part of its own expression, the line, the thick line, the thin line, the cube, the cylinder. And that led to, I think, 2 projects that I want to show, one of Gropius and the other one of Marcel Breuer. Because if it then came to housing, housing suddenly was not understood as in Le Corbusier's sense, an array of columns and a prefabricated element with Roman masses, but it was basically nothing else as the assembly of parts that then became reassembled into houses. So a house then, so every architectural element, the entrance, the courtyard, the upper roof became geometrical parts of which then larger assemblies became orchestrated. Or here, for example, Marcel Breuer, based on the grid, he would have standardized spaces, something you could also see sometimes in Bramante if you looked at it of these grids. And these spaces then assembled towards that larger whole. Now, why I'm showing that is because I have the feeling that within the Bauhaus, there was still the volume, yeah? The cube was its abstraction. But for the Dutch, I think it was the surface, yeah? The Dutch work in modernism, and here Cornelius van Esteren and Duisburg, they were playing with, first of all, I think both of them are very interesting. There is no idea of ground. So if you look at these were all drawn without anything. I don't know. I think it had the idea of Einstein's space. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if there's this idea of the endless space. But I think what is interesting in Duisburg, here it became the assembly of surfaces. Yeah? And the space is generated in principle between surfaces. Yeah? Space is between wall to wall, ceiling to ceiling, ceiling to floor, floor to ceiling, floor to ceiling. And if you see some of the diagrams, you can see them, each of them surfaces were individual. And here they would articulate then into a house where then suddenly they would fill out the roof, yeah? Or somehow and make that space. Now, I show that because I think the Russians took a slightly different thing, even when I'm not an expert, but I guess we have to ask Anna once, really. But I think here, what we can see is there was a play of the abstraction of these masses by pure form of scaling. Yeah? So how can you assemble, and this architectonus gotas, with the idea of assembling parts based on scaling and come up in principle with these forms of abstraction, or here some of these kind of scaled assemblies. Now, of course, you would say, is that the only idea that modernism had? Now, I think there was one parallel track. You know, there was one track that people forgot, one that doesn't fit to that, and that's the track that basically Aldo Rossi took, because he would write the following. He would say, if I would find a 6 foot long, 3 foot wide mound in the forest, I don't know if this translation is right, but I mean, a mound is like a little forest, formed pyramidically with a shovel, yeah, then we understand someone is buried here. And then we understand that is architecture. So what I mean by that is, when there was on the one hand side modernism, then there suddenly was Loos who still said, no, 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 architecture is still something different. It is about gathering space. And the most, I think, interesting diagram that I've seen in that relationship to the relationship of architecture as gathering space is basically then a translation of Hollein, who picked up that idea of Loos. Because when Hollein said, first when you dig in something in the ground, you know, like making fire, or you make a pile, then we can start of talking about architecture, because it has the idea of where a collective memory is there. And these are the diagrams that when I saw them in 1958, I think they are really was sort of predetermined what I would call a postmodern idea of how the object relates to the ground as such. So here the first thing is where he would say, where he would take the Loos idea, he would say, okay, here is the buried guy and here is the fireplace. But then he would say architecture had no other intention to lift itself off the ground in order to make that space. So that means here modernism then tried to lift it off in order to basically circulate underneath. Then we produced the cantilever, and then, and I think this became very interesting, then the building itself became part of the ground and became ground as such. So in that sense, this gave for me a completely new reading of architecture that might not have to do the mass, but have to do with the mass in relationship to the grounds. So this is basically I've stolen that from Kipnis, and since Kipnis knows a lot, but not everything, I've just added some other things, yeah? Yeah? So basically this is the idea of, then this is the idea of Palladio, you know, you lift the thing off. This is my Ledoux guy, you know, you go underneath. This is the Loos guy, you go through. This is my Frank Lloyd Wright, sorry Americans, he just sunk it, you know, he wanted to be, yeah, in the earth, and then Le Corbusier and Mies van Rohe. But I think what Hollein also did, he gave to 4 new diagrams, and I call them the postmodern diagrams, you know. So this is the Eisenman one, figurative ground, figurative space, you know, metaphysics of ground and space. Then the one column project, basically the cantilever, yeah, of Mr. Wolf, yeah, here, Korea. Then of course the folded, you know, ground continuing in the building by OMA. People forget that. This is topological. Koolhaas was once, he was once different. So here, the sort of urban space continuing, and then Zaha, basically, the object dissolved its problem into the ground and became basically dissolved. And I think recently, I think she finished her diagram. Yeah? Or she said once, when you're young, you develop a diagram and then you build it. No, here it is. Now, so that leaves now, of course, to a kind of little vacuum, and it's a vacuum that, of course, is the most difficult to describe, but it's the one that we generally call just postmodernism. And I try with my strange eyes to give a little bit aside to that. Yeah? Now, just to know, I think that's where the discipline of discourse has really created the most distinguished things. I think the European and the American tradition divided, even when I would say the Americans continued the ideas. But just to know, in Europe after the Second World War, you still would teach Bauhaus. Yeah? This would be the pedagogical model in the 50s by Ungers. You still would say, yes, architecture is structure, then it makes surface, and then it makes volumes, you know? And then the structure is a little bit different, the surface is a bit different, and the volume is different, yeah? But I think the Americans have, I think through John Hejduk, done something interesting. They articulated a completely new, for me, understanding, and that was not anymore the idea of the individual parts, but the idea of the field, yeah? So here, my reading of these Texas Rangers houses from John Hejduk, they might be still relating in a certain way to the understanding of the 9 square grid, to Palladio and all that. But if you look at then his diamond house, you know, and if you see that in relationship to the French guy that I showed you on the left side, I think here is a new diagram emerging. It's the idea of the figurative field, or what I call the figure within the field, because suddenly what to my understanding John Hejduk does is he tried to see how the individual part dissolves itself into a field problem. Now I think here you can see it in a kind of axonometric version. And it led to probably the most beautiful, and I think to your history, the most interesting architectural pedagogical model, the one that is the 4 square versus the 9 square. What is so interesting to me on that model is basically it articulates the part in relationship to a periphery. It takes the idea that there is a center and a periphery, but these ones are not as figurative spaces, they are assembled as a grid of columns. And in this grid of columns, you know, you still see them. So basically what happens is there is a modernist diagram of the columns, but it deals with the idea of central periphery. And why this is interesting, because when you read him, what he would define as architecture, then suddenly it's not anymore the 5 points of Le Corbusier, but if you read them, it would be the grid, the post, the grid, the frame, the post, the beam, the panel, the center, the periphery, the field, the edge, the line, the plan, the volume, the extension, compression, tension, and shear, which is really interesting because to me, here he combines architecture as geometrical elements, architectural elements, and force fields that determine that. So there's a causality in architectural parts and a geometrical understanding that he would define as architecture. And I think when I worked on that lecture, I thought this is the most interesting description that I thought of architecture, because suddenly it's not a problem of space anymore. It is space and all its tensionality and abstractions in it. But why Hejduk is such a strange character to me, because when I see the wall house, then I always thought, what is this now? Because the only way I could understand that is not a field of grids, but basically turning every architectural element into an entity of itself. So that the staircase becomes an own entity, the infrastructure becomes an own entity, the wall becomes an own entity. And I think with John Hejduk, there starts a completely new set, and that is the rearrangement of parts to a completely other whole of an unknown whole. And I think, I'm not an expert in that field, but if I looked at that plan, this was the most hilarious plan I've ever seen. You know, it made no sense to look at the eyes from the 19th century. It made no sense to look in the eyes of beginning modernism, because what he suddenly does is everything is a character, and the ensemble of that character produce meaning. I'm very lucky that I have no idea of that work, and so when I saw it the first time, I thought, this is really hilarious. Just realized there's something with the Catholics, you know, there's something Catholic here. Okay. But why I'm saying this and why I'm using that as introduction, because what you can suddenly see here, and I think it's very, and I wouldn't be surprised that he would be rediscovered in the current discourse, because what it does is he reassembles architectural parts to a new whole in which every part is not predetermined to the role or function the part had before. Now, probably as a kind of final thing, I give you the European version of rational architecture, and it looked like this. Yeah? I know it's unknown to you. I think it never, I don't know, it's never have been translated, but there was a book in the 70s in Germany which basically declared architecture is dead. Yeah? And in this architecture of that, it tried to understand what actually do we mean by rational architecture? And I think three interesting characters figured out of which we might can learn something about how the understanding of masses in relationship to city. One, of course, was Aldo Rossi. If you really want to understand it, there was an idea to understand the city as a structure, but that structure was based on geometrical archetypes, but that archetypes had typological references, which means there is something culturally that is related to geometry. Yeah? Then, of course, this is to my friend Peter Tester, of course, and then he builds with three cubes, the cube, the triangle, and the tongue. Yeah? But as you can see, for him, architecture was nothing else as the reassembly of these parts, triggering then a certain meaning. So, for example, the cube is that the cube of the house, the wall is then the city wall, the triangle is then of housing, and so this was the modern cemetery, where certainly every architectural element not only had geometry, but it had a relationship to its meaning within the city as large. And so it ended up with probably this diagram, the city analogia, where anything is allowed to be next to anything independently of its history in time and space, which in principle would mean that architecture is allowed to resemble all its ideas independently of what they mean. Now, Ungers, and this is probably the only thing that I bring in today that might be a little bit unknown to your context, even he, I never understood this, but basically he means morphology. I never understood this, but let's say it's very simple. This is morphology, and then he makes a variation of these houses. But what I think Ungers' contribution is that he came up with an introduction to architecture that was nearly forgotten, and that was the idea of its interiority. Now, these are the 7 diagrams that Ungers have produced in the 70s, based on the relationship of a historian called Schmarzow, who said, what really architecture is its interiority and the way how we relate to objects in space. And so what he came up with, and this was in exhibition, he would say architecture relates, or you could also say these are the kind of the typologies of interiorities. Architecture either relates, for example, to the idea of the shell, which is a wall within a wall. We know it from ideas of the courtyard, or the idea of the labyrinth, or the idea of the gallery, the corridor and then the rooms, or of course the idea of the central space, the idea of the boucher, and the idea of the modernist plan with the floating elements in the middle. So what these 7 diagrams, and the last one was the enfilade, was the idea of how interiority, or what is the typologies of that kind of interiorities. And I think it's something that I would say has been forgotten in the discipline of architecture. But if you look then in, for example, a lecture that Ungers would give in '64 on the idea of museums, he basically would look at the plan of the museum as an autonomy of organizations, of interiorities, of how spaces relate to each other. So he would say what architecture can say about itself is only the way how spaces relate to its own interiority. And here you can see, for example, one lecture dealing with the idea of centrality of the central space, then space within space, or the two-axial one, the corridor one, or the labyrinth. And he would come with a pedagogical model that I found very interesting. He would say architecture, I don't know if this makes sense in English, I had to translate it somehow, it's a binding discipline. And what he meant by that is, he said architecture is not constrained by Architecture is not constrained by site, constrained by material, constrained by form. No, what architecture really does as a uniqueness is it's binding things together to produce something new. Yeah? And so what he would say, what architecture does, is basically binding form, material, site, function, organization into new entities. And so he would come with the most hilarious exercises. He would say, okay, my friends, here it is. Make a house, a cube is given, and now we have two choices. Yeah? Make it look like a cube or dissolve the problem of the cube. Yeah? So that's what he called a form binding problem. But then he would say, given is a site, given is a house, given is a site with sand, make a building, but do me one favor, make it inside out. Yeah? Or then he would say material. Here's a house, I give you a brick, and show me what comes out. Well, as you can see with the Germans, they are lacking some form of inspiration, but don't worry. I would say it's related to Ungers, who denied that you're allowed to think beyond. Yeah? You're not allowed to be an expressionist. Yeah? Well, of course, rationalism jumped over Austria. From Italy. Yeah? So. But, he also did some funny masses, so this was also an interesting thing. It's called thematic binding. It says, make a house, but do me one favor, don't make a hole from the outside. Huh? Yeah, so how do you deal with this? Yeah, and then something functional. And of course, in the end, here we have the maestro of the US, Mr. Koolhaas. Because for Mr. Eisenman, so you see, here it goes, huh? Here it goes, yeah? Here goes my weird on it. But what I think, it took me for a long time really to understand it. I still don't know, but there was, and I have to say thanks to Greg Lynn, within a series of the Archaeological of the Digital, he made a series of interviews, yeah? And there was this funny thing that I never understood, what is the metaphysics of space, yeah? I never understood that, that Eisenman worked on that. And I think in this one thing, I think he tried to explain it. What he meant is, in principle, that to me, that there is something that there is two spaces, like the Romans had, the mass and the void. But what he then shows in the Cannaregio project, that usually mass is just carving out void, yeah? And therefore also subtracting void space. But in the moment that I carve out void, I basically add, void space, yeah? And so the reason why he became interested in the idea of ground, figure is because two figures together would produce a new void, and two grounds together would produce a new other ground or figure. So from my understanding is that he wanted to overcome the Colin Rowe problem, that still said in a collage city that one is basically in his Pochet space, architecture can be architecture can be ground or architecture can be solid, the two modernist diagram. He would still say, but they still have one problem, they always subtract void space. And that's why he became interested, which I think is the figurative ground, yeah? The carved out space in the ground, or what I heard is the idea of the EL house, that you only can see a cube as an understanding between the subtraction of a void space and a mass, yeah? And therefore basically the subtraction between two kind of cubes. Now, of course, his space lies in his much more general understanding of form, and if I look at them, and this is his PhD from 63, if you look at them precisely, I have the feeling they very much relate to the idea of Paul Klee and the understanding of how a formal language of abstraction could be translated, in the understanding of architecture. I think here you can see the diagrams. It would be interesting if there is really a connection to the way Paul Klee tried to understand what the geometry does in terms of content in relation to these cubes. And I think the project come together to me to the real understanding of that idea of figurative ground and figurative void in the Beer Center in Frankfurt, and also later on. It's not anymore the understanding that a building stands on a ground. What it's really about is that one figure and one ground make a figurative void space, and two figures together make a ground in themselves. Now, of course, when I saw then in the exhibition this diagram, I was going totally lost. Yeah? I realized then some of my students said, hey, Peter, it's just a biological code of the DNA. Yeah? And so, but still I didn't know it. So thanks to actually, you could say, Jeffrey Kipnis, who made probably the most beautiful summary, yeah, of the idea of massing of postmodernism, and which is, this is Aldo Rossi. A house is more than a triangle and a cube. Huh? So that means architecture produces meaning if two things come together. But then he says, but if John Hejduk does a house, and a house which is a house with two houses, that's poetry. Yeah? This is not anymore meaning, that's poetic. Yeah? And then he says, and this is what Eisenman does, a cube is a new calculus of, now I hope that someone is doing a thesis on that, I don't know, but I guess it means that like anything, whatever. But to be clear, I think that's the way that I would understand the work has then continued in what I think is our more or less recent contemporary history, where suddenly the geometrical model became nothing as a sphere, I think, or a blob. And I think I always still wanted to show, I think the most, I hardly can find images, but this is the Cardiff Opera House that Lynn designed very early, yeah? Where you can still see that there was an idea of assembling, yeah, these new blobs into a new whole. Now that, I think, started now by trying to get, how can we redefine a new whole? And of course, the relationship between parts of the whole became really interesting because the polyline as an assembly of lines, yeah, became something different than the spline, as you all know, and the idea of the variation of the part, which I would think is in a certain way a kind of neo-Baroque, which tries to incorporate a new whole in which all the parts are integrated in this whole. But since I thought there should be something said to the formal language of the new Dean, then I would say there are two very interesting things that I always found in Hernan's work. Beside all the aesthetics, I think his early work goes very close to Paul Klee's idea of the mutation of the point to the line to the surface to the volume. I think you see it in works like that, where the line turns into a surface and then turns it into a volume. Yeah? But I think his more recent work is I don't have an image from, it's a kind of cross-breeding of things. How do you make out of lines volumes? How do you make volumes out of surfaces? How to make a surface out of lines? How to make a line out of surfaces? Yeah? And so basically, I think there is a modernist trajectory in the understanding of how to play or diversify the idea of abstraction. So, and I thought as a kind of final thing, then I thought, oh, well, I want to summarize and show you what I think we are today. So, I hope you give me 5 minutes. This is a diagram I recently worked on, and it's of course based on what happens with Graham Harman and everything, but it's a diagram that I think many of you might know because it's the idea of the diagram that Rosalind Krauss once used for the idea of the expansion feed of the sculpture. Yeah, so you put two things on the top that are contrary to each other, form and content, and then you say there is something no content and no form. And so this is the diagram that she did, you know, landscape architecture, no landscape, no architecture, and then you get marked side, sculpture, blah, blah. Okay, so I would say on the top, you know, this was always our modernist idea, you know, the rational subject, form follows function, the things have to connect and integrate. Then I think the left side is the autonomy of the form. I mean, as we know, form becomes a pure entity, the famous column, form loses basically its signification, it becomes pure sign itself, it's pure form. Yeah? It doesn't carry something, it only is form in itself. But on the other hand side, the other side, I think is sometimes forgotten, but there was always something which I would call the autonomy of the event. Yeah? Probably not seen so much out here, but very a European project, where the idea is form didn't matter, but what matters is the event itself. And here, the metropolitan guy, you know, the new bachelor, you know, who is in the 9th floor, you know, with his boxing glove eating oysters. That's what architecture can do. It produces events. Yeah? Form doesn't matter. But of course, it became also the idea of the irrational subject. You know, here the Manhattan transcript by Tschumi, where it says, no, modernism wrong. You need the murder. You need the murder. The murder is hunting the guy. You see that the murder is So if this is modernist space, there is also the murder space, the irrational subject, the one that goes off the line. But what he introduces here is a completely new understanding of space. Not only that space has an event, space is a diagram, but also there's the idea that space has a movement. Yeah, and he comes with the most hilarious diagram. I've never understood it, and I hope you will help me, because I'm not a post-structuralist, but I try to understand it. It means that if you have a situation where you have an object, you have a movement, and you have an event, then basically you can also have an object, a different movement with a different event. But since we're in post-structuralism, event can be form, form can be event, and movement can be space. That's what comes out. Yeah? Yeah? So basically, architecture is nothing more as anything can become anything else, yeah? Because it doesn't matter, we will never understand it. Yeah? Which leads to the last definition of event, and that's something that I think is more recently, and I always like that. And this was the event of the idea that Sanford Quinter tried to explain Boccioni's painting. He says what Boccioni did, he never painted really a railway station. What he really painted was a stage of matter. Yeah? And so what you can see is in the farewell painting, you see the matter of water in a liquid phase. You see the matter of, in a gasoline phase, you see matter in a liquid phase, and you see matter in a static phase. Yeah? So there was a representation of matter as a material performance. This was always, I think, on the event side. But I think, as you can see, I think I want to be down here, and I think this is where I hope our discipline goes. It's a discipline of no form and no content, where things have lost their form and their meaning. Now, of course, it's easy to say, but do you have something to show me? Now, this is what I want to show you. This is a window just recently designed in my faculty in Innsbruck. Now, the window is very interesting. You cannot open it anymore. Yeah? It doesn't have a handle. You cannot look outside anymore. It's dark. Yeah? Basically, that no air comes in because you had to put this, because of security, you had to put these ruffles for it. Yeah? And the thing is that, oh, is it? Yeah, there you go. It goes very slow. It doesn't frame anymore the countryside. And so when let's say there was an inspection, yeah, in the building, and I said to them, hey, listen, guys, why can I not open this window? Why? I mean, I get air. And then she said, Mr. Trummer, this window is not for you. This window is for the building. Yeah? And so what I mean by that is that I think we are in a moment, in the age of a post-human architecture, where I guess that any architectural object is going to lose its form and lose its content. And I hope we are turning into the moment where a new sixth column, is emerging next to the Hollein ones. Thank you very much.